Wavy here, welcome to an unboxing and an air-cooled build in the Corsair Air 240. Why are we doing it this way? I'm just sat next to a box talking about what's inside the... You guys don't deserve this, you deserve better. Let's try this instead. The Corsair Carbide Air 240 is a microATX cube case that has the capacity to support mini-ITX and microATX motherboards. It's protected by pretty standard expanded polystyrene packaging, which seems to have done the job nicely, and is enclosed in a plastic bag to avoid incidental scratches. The Corsair Air 240 has a very distinctive style with these continuous ventilation bands that wrap around the majority of the case. This case also features a plastic side panel window to showcase your build inside, and the off-side panel features a flexible external magnetic filter sheet very similar to Fractal Design's ModuVent ventilation panel, which you can check out in the top right. The front panel has a lot going on. There's a rotational Corsair logo central to the ventilation slots to suit the case's multiple orientations, which we'll check out a little later. To the right of the ventilation section is the front I/O, consisting of the reset button, drive activity LED, power button, separate headphone and microphone jacks, and two USB 3.0 ports. The rear of the case supports the access panel to the 3.5-inch hard disk drive cage, as well as a central motherboard position and support for two 80mm fans to the right, something the manual fails to mention at all. Below the hard disk drive cage access panel is the position for an ATX power supply unit, which has an uncommon vertical mounting position, but is a nice feature to reduce the overall thickness of the case. And below the fan positions are the removable PCI Express slot covers, which have an unusual retaining mechanism that we'll check a little later on during GPU installation. There is plenty to discuss on GPU installation, so stick around if that's a key interest you have with this case. Removing the windowed side panel requires the removal of two thumb screws to the rear. These are captive thumb screws, which is always a nice inclusion, however they feel a little too loose, which makes replacing them later a little tricky. Now on to the internals. The rear shows everything we saw earlier, the PCI Express slot covers to the bottom, as well as two 80mm fan positions above, and the motherboard rear I/O shield position to the right. Up top is support for two 120mm fans. It looks like it could be three, but it's a fair way off supporting a third. While we're talking fans, the packaging offers a total support for 9 fans without mentioning the 80mm fans to the rear. So this includes two top fans, two front fans, two bottom fans, an obscure fan to the other side panel, and two 80mm fans to the rear. However, the 80mm fans are mentioned on the webpage for this case, so check that out first when you're looking at specs. But I can only realistically see the 6 120mm fan positions in the main compartment being used in most builds, but we'll cover more on that a little later on. Anyway, the front of the case supports 2 of the 3 included case fans. I would read off a spec sheet about these fans, but I tried looking around. All I can say is they're 3-pin fans and they get pretty loud. I'd recommend replacing them if you plan to have this case on your desk. The motherboard tray has, to my delight, 8 motherboard standoffs pre-installed, and you can clearly see that cable management and style was towards the top of this case's priorities due to all the included rubber grommets. Removing the offside side panel is the same process as the windowed side panel, so let's check out the inside of this compartment. To the rear is the position for the power supply unit, and above this is the removable 3.5-inch drive cage that can store 3 3.5-inch drives. We'll check out more of this in a minute. To the front is the removable 2.5-inch drive cage that can store 3 2.5-inch drives, and just below this is the front I/O PCB. And the base of this compartment contains 4 rubber pads to mount the power supply unit on, and 4 cable management loops towards the front. So let's take a look at those removable drive cages. You can access the 3.5-inch drive sleds by removing the rear panel, which simply requires the removal of 1 thumb screw. Once the door has been removed, the 3 drive sleds can be taken out with the typical pinching of the tabs. You'll notice the box of accessories is in one of these, but we'll check that out in a second. To remove this drive cage entirely is done by removing a single thumb screw from the inside. Once the screw has been removed, the cage can be slid to the left to disengage it from the hooks above, then the cage is free to be removed from the case entirely. The front 2.5-inch drive cage is similar, however removing this one requires access to the top to remove a second screw. To access the top of the chassis, 2 thumb screws need removing from the back of the case to be able to remove the top panel. Once these have been removed, the top panel comes away easily enough and we can take a quick look at the top of the chassis where you can see the top fan mounting positions and the slots for the 3.5-inch drive cage. With the top panel out of the way, the 2.5-inch drive sled can be removed in the same manner as the 3.5-inch drive sleds, and to remove this drive cage entirely requires the thumb screw to be removed from the inside, which we covered earlier, and this second screw at the top. With both of the screws out of the equation, the cage can be slid to the right to disengage the hooks from the chassis, and it's free to be removed entirely. With this compartment completely bare, we can see the full picture of the rear of the motherboard tray, which is of course the same as the front of the motherboard tray, but the other way around. As for the drive sleds and cages, here they all are. You'll notice the 3.5-inch drive sled has mounting holes for 2.5-inch drives, which is always a nice option, and the 2.5-inch drive sleds can take 15mm thick 2.5-inch drives, so if you were to fill all of these sleds with maximum capacity drives, we'd be looking at 51TB of storage. At that point you may well be looking to occupy that offside panel position, but would that be enough? Moving on to removing the front panel, this required the unclipping of a few clips at either side of the case. I found these were pretty unpredictable as to whether they were actually unclipping anything, but one of them was clearly not impressed with my thoughts on the case so far, and in a fit of rage, threw itself across my desk. Taking a look at the front of the chassis, we can see a couple of cable management loops to the right, as well as a hole, which I can only presume is for cable managing the fan cables maybe. Above these is the front I/O PCB, which is black of course, and above that is another hole which again I can only presume can be used to route the top fan cable through to keep it out of sight. And of course there were 2 fans to the left, which we saw earlier. One thing I did want to point out is that there is support for a single central 120mm fan or radiator with the 4 holes in between the 2 fan mounting positions at the front. As for the bottom panel, this can be removed in the same manner as the top panel, and if you were to turn the case with the offside panel as the base, you can mount 2 fans to either side and have a really interesting linear airflow setup with a top panel window, which I think is great, but more on that a little later. Now let's do a quick run through of the included accessories just before we crack on to the build. Inside the box is a resealable bag with all the included accessories, and inside this are 4 adhesive rubber feet, 16 fan screws, 4 SSD pan head screws, 16 SSD screws, 16 motherboard and hard disk drive screws, an extra standoff, 4 long fan screws, and 6 zip ties, and they're all in their separate resealable bags. I'm not completely sure why half of that was included. Not to sound ungrateful, but why are there essentially 32 screws purely for drives when all the drive sleds don't need them? About 9 of those are for the motherboard, and I suppose there are 16 required for the 2.5-inch drive capable 3.5-inch drive sleds, but I can't help but thinking that most of these are going to be wasted by most users. Anyway, that's all the nitpicking. Let's get on to the build. The installation of the power supply unit is very nice. Lowering the power supply unit onto the 4 rubber pads and sliding it to the back of the case is a simple process, and the typical thumb screws through the rear of the chassis does a good job of keeping the power supply unit in place. Note that I'm using a 160mm power supply unit in this build, but there is tons of room for even a 200mm power supply unit if you really wanted to. And you can tell, even with poor cable management, there wouldn't be much of an issue in this case. Obviously I haven't connected anything to the power supply unit yet, but it's always good to know how much you can get away with. As for the fan cables, these can be routed out of the way through the many grommets available. It's really nice to see how many grommets there are, and they would really help if you were going for that lazy rear cable management mentioned earlier. Okay, now for the real stuff. Let's drop in the standard system featured in all microATX air-cooled builds just after we pop in the rear I/O shield. This system comprises of an MSI Z170M Mortar motherboard, which houses 24 gigs of DDR4 and an i7-6700K, cooled by a Cooler Master Hyper 212 Evo, which review you can check out in the top right-hand corner. Thanks to the pre-installed standoff post, dropping the whole system in was child's play, and thanks to all the other pre-installed standoffs, I could simply move on to securing the motherboard in place with all the included screws. With the motherboard in position, the motherboard power cable can be connected through the conveniently placed grommet, and the CPU power cable can be routed through a little cutout in the top left of the motherboard tray, a very nice, much appreciated addition. Okay, you may have come across the issue we're facing right now, and if you did, please answer in a postcard, or in the comments, if you really have to. Yeah, if you can notice the edge of this cooler, the ends of the heat pipes, before you can see the edge of this case, you'll be in the same boat as I am, only you probably got there a lot quicker than I did. Unfortunately, this cooler just does not fit inside this case. I'm actually sort of partially resting my hand on the top of this cooler and against the side of the case. The panel will not go on. So this has hit a couple of snags that I've had a little think about. Unfortunately, I won't be able to add this case into the case thermal testing graphs and results, only I will add results of some sorts. What we're going to do is we're going to swap out that cooler with this cooler, which is a Be Quiet Pure Rock Slim. It has a nice little 92mm fan, so we're not going to be having the dual 120mm fans on here. And because it's a completely different cooler, we cannot add it to the comparison chart. If we did, that would be going against a fair test. And I'm not sure what you know about a fair test, but you can only really change one variable before it becomes illegitimate to compare things. Although some people have tried to explain to me that that is not the case in previous comments on previous videos. Unfortunately, they did not attend the same sorts of physics classes that I did when I was in high school. So yeah. So anyway, we're going to be changing this out with the Pure Rock Slim. It's a nice looking cooler. We're also going to be doing a review of that potentially next week. In the comments if you'd like to see that, or thumbs up, or however you want to express that. Let me know if you'd like to see this one. We've got a few others lined up. So yeah, check that video out for the Cooler Master Hyper 212 Evo. And yeah, so I'm going to be doing that in the background. You won't see that. I'll just get it done and we can just move on with the rest of this video. I apologize for the delay. This will likely cause a delay. I'm likely not going to be able to finish this by the end of the day. It's already about 9 o'clock now, and yeah, I've already got to do all the rest of the recording. But yeah, anyway, 2 minutes too late, so I will catch you in a second for the rest of the video. I hope you enjoy it, and yeah. So with the CPU cooler changed over, let's install all the storage for this system. In previous videos, I've included a 14mm 4TB 2.5-inch hard disk drive, which serves as backup for all the drives you see here. But for this case, we've got a Samsung 840 250GB boot SSD, a 240GB Kingston SSD which serves as an editing scratch disk, and a 2TB Seagate Barracuda hard disk drive for the bulk of the program storage and video archiving duties. Remember, when replacing the 2.5-inch drive cage, you need to replace this screw. I say need to, you could get away without it, but it's not worth risking the data. Since there aren't any 3.5-inch hard disk drives on the microATX test system and watching data cables being plugged in is boring, we can move on to the rest of the cables. Routing the GPU power cables through the second of the lower grommets, I'm really liking the grommet situation on this case. We can move on to sorting out the front I/O cables. The front I/O cables are encapsulated in this foam cover, which is a nice addition to prevent scratches to anything during shipping. After tearing this off, I was pleasantly surprised to see the USB 3.0 connector was created with black plastic instead of the standard blue plastic. It's not exactly the most amazing thing, but it's something that someone decided at some point during the specification process for this product, and a positive is a positive. Unfortunately, the same treatment wasn't given to the audio connector's rainbow wires, but you can't have everything. And if by magic, the front I/O is all installed. In case you missed it, the USB 3.0 was plugged into the header above the SATA data cables to the right. Okay, onto GPU installation. This is going to get some hate, but there is plenty to improve here. First, this retention bracket needs opening, which I thought was pretty interesting, similar to how many workstation cases function. With this bracket open, the PCI Express slot covers can be removed, ready to take your GPU of choice. But let's back up a second. The GPU that I've used for all microATX case builds is this R9390X. Notice how it's not exactly fitting in. That's down to the card's steel chassis that protects the card interacting with the case's chassis. There's more to come, but let's deal with this issue first. After about 5 attempts to install the card in all sorts of different angles, it wasn't going to be an easy fit. As far as I saw it at the time, the issue was specific to this card, so I thought little of it and decided to work around the problem. You can see from this angle that the card can physically fit inside the case, which is a hint of what's to come. See if you can work it out before we get there. So after a decent last attempt to fit the card in, with all PCI Express slot covers removed and the steepest angle, it wasn't looking good, but there's something that can fix this problem. With a pair of pliers and some poorly chosen packaging material, the solution was to bend the panel out with the intention to bend it back once the GPU was in place. Unfortunately, the foam packing material wasn't strong enough to prevent the pliers from piercing through it, but some kitchen paper worked just fine. I know it looks horrendous and it's not something I would advise. I'm only doing this for the purposes of getting this video out and I have no other options available. So the GPU managed to fit in just fine after this, but now it's the problem of cleaning up the mess. The pliers did, in my opinion, a great job of getting the system to work, and a minute later the chassis was back to normal, apart from a couple of paint scratches which was down to the foam used before. And please don't mistake the bend in the chassis just below as damage, that's the recess for the retention bracket to clip back into. So overall, not a bad fit, but it's not over yet. There's a horrendous amount of GPU sag that needs addressing. I wouldn't advise anyone to leave it like this, and replacing the retention bracket does nothing to help this. The holes here are not threaded, and the only screws with this case that would fit are the SSD pan head screws. Unfortunately, these alone are not big enough to handle the task, but adding a washer into the mix improves the situation a lot, and the retention bracket just about fits back on afterwards. Just to be 100% clear here, the instructions would have you leave it without any screws, and there are far bulkier cards that can fit into this case, especially the two Radeon cards shown on their webpage. And there are no maximum graphics card widths stated, so here is my recommendation. Since this card, the MSI R9390X, is 129mm wide, make sure you have a card that is a maximum of 120mm wide. For basic reference, the reference GTX 1070 is 111mm wide, but an EVGA GTX 1070 for the Win Edition is 129mm wide. There's probably a few of you out there saying, why are you talking about this for so long? It's not really a big deal, but you can work that out for yourself in a second. Fitting the offside panel back on was a simple process. You'll notice the cable management wasn't very tidy, but it's somewhat organised rather than strapped down. The top panel slotted back in place as easily as it came off, and 2 screws later we can move on to the front panel. The front panel has to go on last due to the overhang top and bottom. This isn't really a big deal since it's just a case of tipping the case onto its side and repeating the same process as the top panel. Once both top and bottom panels are secured in place, the front panel can be brought back in and snapped into position. Easy, right? Now what's left is the windowed panel and we're off to the races, right? Well, here's why I was going on about the GPU for so long. The windowed side panel needs more effort than the other panel, and that's clearly because this case was not designed to take this graphics card, or many other current generation powerhouse cards like the RX Vega 64 and many of the aftermarket GTX 1080, 1080 Ti's and 1070s. If you get this case and don't take GPU width into account, you may well end up with a similar result. Whether you think so or not, this is a big deal and it should be explicitly noted on specifications of this case, and to be fair, all other cases, but especially in a smaller form factor case like this. As a final touch, the adhesive feet can be added. I'm not a big fan of an adhesive being involved with this case when it can stand in so many different ways. It would have been nice to have some sort of reusable mechanical secret fixing, but that's just something to add to a future iteration of this design, I suppose. And you can buy extra feet from the Corsair store if you need them. Alright, so what are we looking at in terms of temperatures? Well, it's not good and I can't say it's down to the case. I actually think this case has a strong ventilation area, but when a Hyper 212 Evo struggles to keep the 6700K lower than 90 degrees in many cases during a Prime 95 small FFTS test, a cooler that is a lot smaller is always going to struggle. So the CPU hit 100 degrees very quickly, and the CPU test was stopped at 23 seconds in. However, the GPU did complete the 10-minute test and ended up at 94 degrees C. The question is, can we improve any of that? Well, let's change out all the stock included fans with 2200 RPM VADA fans and see if we can add a total of 6 120mm fans to the main compartment. So we've got 2 120mm fans up top and we're fixing 2 120mm fans in the front, but how about some fans in the base? Well, this is where I found out something that I really didn't want to find out. You can only fit in bottom fans if you use a mini ITX motherboard. On this motherboard, the SATA connector block was in the way, but regardless of this, if you were lucky enough to find a board where none of the front I/O protruded into the 120mm fan mounting area, you would still not be able to connect anything into any of the front I/O connectors. The least I can do in this situation is place a note inside the case for the next owner as a warning, so they don't make any bigger plans than I have for the bottom of this case. Joking aside, I removed the paper before testing the case with 4 120mm 2200 RPM fans. So how did it do? Well, actually, it didn't do any better than before, so we can pretty much put this poor test result down to the cooler and not the case. But the GPU was 4 degrees cooler, but there would be a much larger difference if we had a mini-ITX board and 2 120mm fans in the base. So with that out of the way, let's take a quick look at the finished build, and I'll catch you in a second for a wrap up. So I thought I'd end this video on a more personal level. Instead of me doing a voiceover of the footage at the end and that sort of stuff, there will be a little bits here and there as I talk. I wanted to do a bit more of a wrap-up personally. I have had some pretty steep criticism about this case. Clearly the GPU information is not all there when you go to buy this sort of thing. It really should be. The CPU cooler information is there, but there's nothing for you to be able to work out what kind of aftermarket GPU cooler option, third-party reference design or whatever you're going to do. There's no information for you to be able to decide that prior to getting this case. In pretty much every single case, in fact every other case that I have purchased and done on this channel has not needed that information there, because it's been able to fit the large coolers that I've been putting into them. The one with the extra water block on there, which increases the thickness of the cooler as well. They've all been able to deal with that, but this one has not, and that's very disappointing. I think most of my criticisms come down to the GPU. I think it's very poorly thought of. It kind of seems like an afterthought. Kind of seems like they'll add some stuff in to be able to support the GPU. They didn't put the information out there. The retention bracket idea seems like a decent idea. I mean, I've seen workstation PCs in work have this sort of clip which actually has pins in there to hold the GPU in place so it doesn't create a sag. This doesn't have pins, it just has sort of very mild pressure on the metal, and it's just weak. It cannot support this graphics card at all. And there are bigger cards, like I said, that even in the documentation on the website for this case, there are included there. So yeah, I think I'm tripping over words a bit too much, but I want to do something quite raw and that sort of thing. I'm not hating on the case. I actually would recommend this case, as long as you've done your research into whether you have or are going to get the right components. So 120mm thickness of a GPU maximum. Do not go past that, otherwise you're going to have pressure issues with these cables against this panel like I'm having. 9mm will make all the difference for that. Make sure you've got the right size cooler for your CPU, and to be honest, you're going to need a much larger CPU cooler than that, like you would have found out in the thermal testing results. You'll need a far bigger CPU cooler than this one to cool an i7 6700K and more mainstream ones, 8700K, 7700K, and higher than that. Anything around the 90 watt processor mark, TDP, you're going to want to get a massive cooler on that one and see if you can get something better than that. But you'll have to check out different CPU cooler reviews for that sort of thing. I'm doing some, but I'm not going to be able to get them done anywhere near as quickly as you probably want them to be done. So anyway, stick around if you'd like to see any of those. Let me know if you liked the video or not. Let me know what I did wrong as well in the comments, likes and dislikes appropriately. Also suggestions for future content on cases, CPU coolers, maybe other components if you really feel you'd like them to be seen on this channel, and I'll do my best to cover them. So thank you very much for checking out the video, and I will catch you in the next one hopefully. Next one will be this cooler actually, I think. Not unless you want a different one. Let me know in the comments, I've got a few lined up already. Catch you in the next one. See you then. Bye.